I'm going to tell you something that most people who were there that night don't talk about. Not because they can't, not because someone told them to keep quiet, but because the moment you try to put it into words, the actual moment I mean, when she turned around and her eyes found mine across that corridor, you realize that words were built for human experiences. And what I witnessed in Sector Voss wasn't entirely human. It wasn't entirely anything I had a name for before that night. My name is Dalen Marsh. I was 31 years old when it happened. I worked cargo logistics for the Midrim Freight Authority, which sounds boring because it was boring. I moved containers. I filed manifests. I argued with customs officials on 17 different stations spread across the habitable edge of galactic contested space, and mostly I lost those arguments and paid the fees. I was ordinary, deliberately ordinary. My father used to say that the safest thing a human could be in those years was forgettable, and I had spent my entire adult life being exactly that. The Covenant expansion had been going on for 11 years by then. If you don't know the Covenant, and some of you listening to this from the inner worlds might not, they were the dominant galactic authority bloc. 6 species, coalition government, unified military command. They controlled the resource lanes, the communication relays, the jump gate licenses. If you wanted to move anything across contested space, you moved it through their checkpoints. You paid their fees. You smiled at their soldiers and you looked at the ground and you did not make trouble. And you absolutely, under any circumstances, did not make eye contact with the special units. We all knew the rule. Every freight hauler, every station worker, every bottom-rung human scraping out a living in the outer corridors knew it. The Covenant had tiers of military personnel. Regular ground soldiers were fine, bored, bureaucratic, interested mostly in their next rotation leave. Border enforcement was unpleasant but manageable. The Veth enforcers, their heavy infantry, you gave a wide berth and didn't argue about manifest discrepancies. But the Ashkari, the vampire warriors, you kept your eyes down, full stop, no exceptions. I knew the rule. I had followed the rule for 9 years without incident. I want to be very clear about that. I was not careless. I was not reckless. What happened in Corridor 9 of Station Muraveth was an accident, a fraction of a second accident, and it changed the rest of my life in ways I still haven't fully sorted through, sitting here, 6 years later, talking into this recorder. But before I tell you what she did, I have to tell you what I saw, because that's where the story really starts, not with the accident, not with the fear. It starts with what an ordinary human man saw when he looked, really looked, at something the universe had told him was too dangerous to see. Document 2, Station MIRAVTH, Physical Description and Operational Context. Cross-referenced from Freight Authority Field Notes, Personal Observations of D. Marsh. Station Muraveth sat at the edge of what the Covenant called the Amber Corridor, a stretch of space between 3 contested systems where the resource lanes overlapped and the jump traffic got so thick that collision prevention systems ran at 94% capacity around the clock. It wasn't a pretty station. Nothing about it suggested that anyone had designed it with aesthetics in mind. It had been built in layers, the way a coral reef builds itself, one emergency expansion after another, each new section welded onto the previous one without much thought for how they'd eventually fit together. The result was a structure that made no visual sense from the outside, and even less from the inside. Corridors ran at odd angles. Some sections had standard 1G artificial gravity. Others, due to aging compensators, ran at 0.8 or 1.3, which meant your sense of weight shifted as you moved through the station, giving the whole place a slightly dreamlike quality even when you were fully alert. The lighting was industrial fluorescent in most sections, that particular cold blue-white that makes everyone look slightly ill, punctuated occasionally by the amber emergency strips that someone had installed years ago and never updated because the station had long since moved past the point where comprehensive maintenance was possible. The population of Murrayville was maybe 4,000 on a quiet cycle. During peak transit windows, when 3 or 4 major cargo convoys converged, it could spike to 8 or 9,000, which pushed every system, environmental, sanitation, food service, security, to its actual limits. You could feel it when the population was high. The air got a little stale. The queues at customs got longer. The tension in the common areas got tight in a specific way, like a rope that's been twisted one too many times and is starting to fray at the center. Cycle 447 was a peak window. 3 convoys, 2 independent freight operations, and a Covenant military logistics rotation all overlapping in a 40-hour window. The station was at about 7,000 souls by the time I arrived with my convoy. The Aldrin Reach and her 2 support haulers, running compressed mineral slurry from the Yenith mining operation to a processing station 4 jumps away. We were stopping at Murrayville for mandatory rest rotation, refueling, and what my manifest described as customs compliance review, which was a polite way of saying the Covenant border officers were going to go through our cargo with whatever level of thoroughness the supervising officer felt like applying that day. I'd been through Murrayville 6 times before. I knew the layout well enough to navigate without checking the station map. I had a specific routine: offload my personal bag at the civilian transit dormitory in Section C, eat something from the automated food stall near the junction of corridors 4 and 7, file my preliminary manifest review at Customs Terminal 3, where a particular Covenant processing officer named Veth something, I could never pronounce the second syllable of her name, had learned over 2 years to process my paperwork without the usual delay games, and then find somewhere quiet to sleep for 6 hours before the actual inspection. It was a routine, a reliable, boring, safe routine. Corridor 9 is where the routine ended. Corridor 9 connected Section B's freight receiving area to the main customs processing hall. It was a long stretch, probably 200 meters, with loading bays on the left side and a series of administrative offices on the right. The lighting in Corridor 9 was particularly bad that cycle. 2 of the main panels had gone out, and the emergency amber strips were doing most of the work, which meant everything in that corridor was rendered in shades of orange and shadow. The floor was metal grating. Your footsteps echoed in a way that made you unconsciously walk softer, try to be smaller, quieter. I was alone in the corridor, or I thought I was. I was walking fast because I was running late for my customs window. Veth something's scheduling system gave you a 30-minute slot, and if you missed it, you went to the back of the queue, which could cost you 8 hours. My bag was over one shoulder. I was reading the updated manifest summary on my handheld device, which meant my eyes were mostly down and my attention was split. Which is the only reason I'm alive, I think. If I had been fully alert, fully watching, I might have sensed her sooner. I might have done the correct thing: eyes down, soft step, don't acknowledge, keep moving, before the moment of eye contact became possible. But I was distracted and tired and running late. And I looked up. Document 3, the ASHKARI, Recorded Observation and Intelligence Summary. Compiled from Freight Authority Traveler Advisories, Civilian Incident Reports, and Personal Testimony. Let me back up for a moment. Let me tell you what I knew about the Ashkari before that night, because context matters here. The fear I felt wasn't ignorant fear. It wasn't the fear of something unknown. It was the fear of something I knew about very well, from a very safe distance, in briefings and traveler advisories and whispered conversations in loading bays. The Ashkari were approximately, and I use that word precisely because nothing about them was quite exact, approximately humanoid. Bipedal, bilateral symmetry, 2 arms and 2 legs and a head positioned as you'd expect. The resemblance to humans stopped there, or close to there, or in a way that almost but not quite was its own particular kind of disturbing. They were taller than humans. Average Ashkari height was somewhere between 2.1 and 2.4 meters, which meant they looked down at essentially everyone they encountered. Their build was lean in a way that suggested efficiency, not the bulk of heavy infantry, but the specific, functional leanness of something that moves very quickly and hits very hard. Their skin was what the advisories called variable pigmentation. It could range from deep charcoal to something closer to pale ash, sometimes with undertones of blue or violet depending on lighting and apparently emotional state, though the advisories were vague on the mechanics of that. Their eyes were the most documented feature. The Ashkari had eyes that functioned across a much broader spectrum than human vision. They saw into infrared without enhancement. They could track movement in near total darkness, and their pupils could dilate or contract with a speed that human eyes couldn't match. In the advisories, there were pages about the eyes, how they reflected light differently from human eyes, how the color could shift from something approximating normal dark colors in low emotion states to something luminescent, almost glowing when the Ashkari was in a state of high alert or aggression. How, when an Ashkari met your eyes, they were not just seeing you the way you saw them. They were cataloging, processing. Their visual cortex was connected differently. They could read micro-expressions, body temperature variation, cardiovascular rate shifts, the tiny unconscious movements of a body's stress response, all from the eyes, all in the first second of contact. The advisory used the phrase functionally empathic to describe this, then added, in a parenthetical that I had always found uniquely terrifying. Note: Ashkari individuals in tactical deployment states should be considered capable of assessing civilian threat potential within 1.2 seconds of visual contact. Non-threatening postures should be adopted immediately and maintained without exception. There were other things I knew. The Ashkari had a metabolic system that processed energy differently from most humanoid species. They required a supplemental nutrient compound that the Covenant produced in controlled facilities, which was part of what made them dependent on Covenant infrastructure, and therefore deployable as a specialized military unit. The compound had a colloquial name that most human freight workers used, bloodpack. Whether it bore any resemblance to the thing the name implied, I genuinely didn't know. The advisories didn't specify. I had never asked anyone who would know. They were fast, not fast for their size fast. The documented reaction time for an Ashkari warrior in combat readiness was measured in fractions of a second that started to challenge the boundary between biological and mechanical. A Covenant military analyst had once written, in a public briefing summary that circulated widely among outer corridor civilians, that an Ashkari warrior in engagement state can close a 20-meter gap in approximately 1.8 seconds under standard gravity conditions. I had read that line many times. It had never been anything but an abstract, alarming statistic. It was not abstract anymore, standing in Corridor 9. The Ashkari I saw that night was female. I use that term because it's the closest human approximation. The Ashkari had biological sex analogs that didn't map perfectly onto human categories, but the Covenant used gender pronouns in their official communications, and she was how this particular warrior was designated. She was in what I would later understand to be partial mission gear, not full combat deployment armor, but the intermediate configuration the Ashkari used for station security or escort duty. Dark composite body armor over the shoulders, chest, and forearms. A utility harness across her torso. A sidearm that I didn't recognize the model of, but that was significantly larger than anything a human security officer would carry. The armor was matte black with a narrow stripe of deep red along the shoulder lines. I would later learn this indicated unit designation within the Ashkari Corps. Her hair, where it was visible, was dark and cut close to her head in a way that looked functional rather than styled. Her face, the parts I saw in that fraction of a second before everything in my body started screaming, was sharp-featured in the way that the Ashkari faces in advisories always were. Angular jawline, high cheekbones, features that were proportionally similar to human faces but somehow more precise, as if someone had taken a human face and refined it according to a standard that human genetics had never been optimized for. She was standing at the far end of Corridor 9, near a loading bay door that I now noticed had been locked in a specific way, not the standard magnetic lock, but something additional, a secondary securing mechanism that I'd never seen on that door before. She was standing with her back to me, which is why I had walked almost 40 meters into the corridor before I registered her presence. She was doing something with a panel on the wall near the locked door. Her movements were precise and unhurried. Whatever she was accessing, she was doing it with complete focus. Her head was slightly bowed. Her hands were moving in small, controlled motions over what I realized was a concealed access terminal that I hadn't known existed in that corridor. I stopped walking when I saw her. That was the correct response. Stop. Don't announce yourself. Don't make sudden movements. Turn around slowly and leave the corridor. Take a different route to Customs Terminal 3. File the mental note that Corridor 9 was in active Ashkari operational use that cycle and avoid it for the remainder of your station time. I stopped. I began to turn. I was following the protocol. And then my handheld device, the one I'd been reading my manifest on, the one I had forgotten was still active in my hand, chose that exact moment to emit the alert tone for my customs appointment reminder. A high-pitched triple beep, not loud by human standards, probably barely audible to most people. The Ashkari heard it. She turned. And I, like an absolute fool, turned back at the same moment, some reflex, some involuntary response to the sound of my own device, and our eyes met across 40 meters of amber-lit corridor. That was the accident. 1 second, maybe less. Long enough. Document 4, the moment of eye contact, personal testimony. D. Marsh, recorded oral account, Station Medavith Transit Facility, Cycle 453. You want to know what I saw in her eyes, in that 1 second? I saw everything. I saw nothing. I'm being serious. Both of those things are true, and I can't resolve them into something more coherent, even 6 years later. There was the obvious stuff, the physical stuff that the advisories had described. The pupils were large in the low light of the corridor, but even as I watched, in that one fractured second, they contracted with a speed that human eyes simply don't do, snapping to a precise calibrated diameter the way a camera lens adjusts. The iris, which might have appeared dark in better lighting, had caught the amber of the emergency strips, and there was something in the color that wasn't quite right, not glowing, not the dramatic luminescence that some of the more sensational accounts describe, but alive in a way that felt distinct from how human eyes look alive. Human eyes reflect light. These eyes seem to do something additional with it. But that's the technical description, and it misses the actual experience. The actual experience was this: I felt seen, not just noticed, not just observed, seen, in a way that went through the skin and whatever we carry underneath it, the anxieties, the calculations, the small navigating self-deceptions that everyone uses to get through a day. She looked at me, and in 1 second I felt like the outer layers had been peeled off, and whatever remained was being assessed clearly, and without any of the diplomatic fog that humans usually extend to each other in social situations. It was not comfortable. It was also, and I say this with full awareness of how strange it sounds, the most honest I have felt in my adult life, because there was no point pretending. There was nothing to hide behind. She was going to know what I was in that second, whether I wanted her to or not. What I was, in that second, was terrified, and completely honest about being terrified. My handheld device was still beeping. The sound seemed to get farther away. The corridor, which had felt like a normal corridor a minute ago, now felt like it had very specific walls and a very specific distance between me and the far end of it where she was standing. My bag was on my shoulder. My feet had stopped moving of their own accord. My mouth was open slightly. I didn't know that until later, until a reviewing medic mentioned it as an indicator of acute stress response, the slight drop of the lower jaw. She was facing me fully now. She had turned completely from the access panel. She was standing in a posture that I can only describe as completely still, not the stillness of something at rest, but the stillness of something with the option to move very quickly, being held in check by a conscious decision. Her right hand was not on her sidearm. I noticed that specifically because I was looking for it. Her hand was at her side. Her left hand was slightly raised, not a gesture, just the position it was in from the panel work, frozen mid-motion when she turned. She was looking at me. I was looking at her. The corridor was silent except for my device, which beeped a second time. And then she did something that none of the advisories had prepared me for. None of the whispered loading bay conversations, none of the traveler briefings, none of the second-hand accounts I'd collected over 9 years of working outer corridor freight runs. She tilted her head. A small motion, maybe 20 degrees to the left, slow, deliberate, like something recalibrating. Her eyes didn't leave mine. Her posture didn't change. Just the head tilting, the way a very intelligent animal does when it encounters something unexpected and decides, before reacting, to think about it first. That motion was somehow more terrifying than aggression would have been. Aggression I had a category for. I knew what to do with a threat that announced itself as a threat. This was something different. This was assessment. This was something deciding what category I fell into. I did not move. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't discipline or training or the brave application of the correct civilian protocol. My legs had simply stopped receiving clear signals from my brain, and my brain had, in turn, stopped generating clear signals because it was occupied entirely with the question of what was going to happen in the next 3 seconds. The Ashkari warrior looked at me for, and I am aware this sounds like a cliché, but I have thought about it carefully and it's accurate. What felt like a very long time and could have been no more than 5 seconds. Then she lowered her head slowly back to center. She held my gaze for one more moment. And then, with the same unhurried precision she'd used at the access panel, she turned back to the wall. She went back to what she was doing. Her hands resumed their motion over the concealed terminal. Her posture returned to that focused, inward-directed stillness of someone completing a technical task. She had dismissed me. That was the terrifying part. Not the confrontation. There was no confrontation. What she did next wasn't an attack, wasn't a warning, wasn't even an acknowledgement in any formal sense. She dismissed me. She assessed me in 5 seconds, reached whatever conclusion her very fast, very accurate threat assessment process had reached, and returned to her work as if the accidental eye contact of one ordinary human cargo worker was simply not relevant to anything she was doing. I walked, I think walked is the generous description. Lurched might be more honest. Backwards 12 steps to the nearest corridor junction, turned, and went 3 sections out of my way to get to Customs Terminal 3 by an alternate route. I was 11 minutes late for my appointment window. Veth something gave me a look that might have been sympathy. She processed my paperwork without sending me to the back of the queue. I said nothing about Corridor 9. I didn't sleep that night. Document 5, Context. The Covenant Occupation and Human Status in Contested Space. Background Analysis, Midrim Freight Authority Internal Briefing, Cycle 441. To understand why that moment in the corridor shook me the way it did, why I was still awake at hour 6 of my rest rotation, staring at the ceiling of the dormitory bunk with my heart doing something irregular and my hand still faintly unsteady. You have to understand what those years were like for humans in outer corridor space. I want to be careful here because there's a version of this story that gets told as drama, as the story of human resistance, of defiance, of our species rising up against oppression. And while that story isn't wrong exactly, it flattens the texture of what it actually felt like from the inside. The reality was slower and smaller, and more exhausting than drama allows. Humans had been spacefaring for 112 years by the time of the Covenant expansion. 112 years sounds like a long time. By galactic standards, it was approximately nothing. The Covenant's oldest member species had been traveling between stars for over 4,000 years. The youngest had been doing it for 800. Humanity arrived in galactic contested space as the newest, smallest, most under-equipped participant in a negotiation that had already been going on for millennia. And we arrived without allies, without leverage, and without a clear understanding of what we were actually dealing with. The Covenant wasn't evil. I want to say that carefully. It's easy, from a human perspective, to slot them into the role of the villain, and parts of their behavior certainly justified resentment and fear. But their power over us was mostly structural rather than malicious. They controlled the infrastructure because they had built it. They enforced their regulations because the regulations served their economic interests. And they deployed units like the Ashkari in human traffic-heavy areas because they had learned early in the expansion that some human populations responded to softer enforcement with attempts at autonomous action that disrupted their resource lanes. The Ashkari weren't there to oppress us. They were there to maintain operational security for Covenant interests. We happened to be near those interests. Our fear of them was, in the Covenant's strategic framework, probably considered a useful byproduct rather than a primary objective. None of that made it easier to live with. Humans in the outer corridors during those years operated under a specific kind of low-grade chronic tension, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it's always present. You got up, you did your work, you smiled at the Covenant customs officials, you paid your fees, you kept your manifest accurate, you followed the rules, and underneath all of it was the constant low hum of knowing that you existed at the sufferance of a power structure that could decide tomorrow that your particular piece of the system wasn't worth maintaining, that your route wasn't profitable enough, that your species was proving too much administrative trouble. Most human freight workers I knew had developed elaborate personal protocols for managing this, careful avoidance behaviors, very specific patterns of where they looked and didn't look, how they moved through Covenant-controlled spaces, which officials they cultivated relationships with, and how. We were experts at being small and navigable and useful without being notable. My father's old advice, be forgettable, was its own kind of survival wisdom. The Ashkari represented the far end of that tension. They were the point where the low hum could potentially become something much louder. Most of us would go our entire careers without meaningful interaction with them. The avoidance protocols made that possible. But they were always present in the calculations, always the distant thunder that meant you kept watching the weather. And here I was, having accidentally made eye contact with one in a poorly lit corridor, and spent the rest of the night trying to understand what exactly that meant for me. Document 6. What happened afterward? Observations from Station MIRAVTH, Cycle 447-449. Personal Journal of D. Marsh, Partial Reconstruction. Here's what I expected to happen in the hours and days after Corridor 9. Nothing, or trouble. Those felt like the two options. Either the eye contact was as inconsequential as her dismissal of me had suggested, and life continued, or I had triggered some Covenant protocol that I wasn't aware of, and trouble arrived in some form I hadn't anticipated. What actually happened was neither, or it was both, in a way that took me several days to understand. On the morning after the incident, hour 12 of Cycle 447, I was waiting in the customs processing area for the physical inspection of the Aldrin Reach's cargo when a Covenant logistics officer approached me. Not an Ashkari, a regular Covenant military administrator, one of the Kethal species who did most of the administrative work in these stations. Small, compact, organized in the specific way the Kethal tend to be, with the characteristic slight iridescence to their skin, and the unsettling habit their species had of maintaining eye contact for a few beats longer than most species did. I'm using she, based on the designation on her uniform badge, said my name. Got it right, which surprised me because most Covenant officials in the outer corridors didn't bother memorizing human names with any precision. I said yes, that was me. She handed me a physical data chit, pressed it into my hand without explanation, then walked away without any of the usual customs pleasantries. I stared at the chit for a long time before I had the nerve to read it. It wasn't an arrest notice. It wasn't a sanctions document or an additional customs review request or any of the other administrative tools the Covenant used when they wanted to create difficulty for outer corridor freight operators. It was a route authorization. A specific, clearance-stamped route authorization for the Yenethta processing run that I was operating, not the standard authorization that all registered freight operators could access, but an enhanced authorization that reduced checkpoint stops from 7 to 3 and cut typical transit time by almost 40%. At the bottom of the document, in the field marked Authorizing Officer, there was a designation code. Covenant military designations are complex, and I'd never been good at parsing them quickly, but I sat with this one for a while, turning the chit in my hands, until I worked out enough of the structure to understand what I was looking at. The Authorizing Officer designation began with Ash, the Covenant classification prefix for Ashkari unit members. She had authorized my route clearance. The Ashkari warrior from Corridor 9 had, at some point between hour 0 dark of cycle 447 and hour 12, submitted a route authorization on my behalf through the Covenant logistics system. I genuinely did not know what to do with that information. Document 7, the second encounter. MIRAVTH Common Area, Hour 15, Cycle 448. Personal Testimony, D. Marsh. I need to tell you about what happened the next day, because Corridor 9 was just the beginning, and the second encounter was where I started to understand that my framework for what was happening was entirely wrong. I had not planned to stay at Muravith for more than the standard rest rotation. The route authorization chit had changed the practical math of my operation enough that I could afford to wait out the peak transit window rather than rushing back into the jam of the corridor. Fewer checkpoints meant faster overall transit time, even accounting for the extra cycle at station. So I was still there on cycle 448, eating something approximately food-shaped from one of the automated dispensers in the Section C common area, when the Ashkari warrior walked into the room. She was not in partial mission gear this time. She was in what I would learn was the Ashkari equivalent of downtime attire, still austere, still functional, but lighter than the armor and without the full utility harness. A dark garment that covered her from throat to wrists to ankles. A single small insignia at her left shoulder. The sidearm was still present. I would later understand that Ashkari warriors didn't separate from their sidearms in contested space stations, regardless of status, the same way you wouldn't ask a surgeon to remove their hands before dinner. The Section C common area had about 30 people in it when she entered. Mostly human, a few Kethal, 2 beings from a species I didn't have a name for. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when an Ashkari appears, not total silence, but a muffling, a drawing inward, like every organism in the space simultaneously deciding to reduce its visible footprint. She ignored all of them. She walked to the food dispenser section. Selected something, I couldn't see what from where I was sitting, stood at the counter to eat it, with the same economy of motion she seemed to bring to everything. I was 10 meters away. I was staring at my own food and trying very hard to be the most forgettable object in the room. I had been successful at this for approximately 4 minutes when she moved. She picked up her food and her container, and she walked to the table where I was sitting, and she sat down across from me. Not near me, not at an adjacent table, across from me at my table in the way that in human social behavior would signal deliberate social approach. The people nearest us in the common area very quietly found reasons to be elsewhere within the next 60 seconds. I was looking at my food. I was doing an excellent impression of a person who was calm and had not just had the entire structure of the moment rearranged. My hands were flat on the table because that was the protocol for non-threatening posture, and also because if they hadn't been flat on the table, they would have been shaking. I heard her eat something. It sounded normal. That surprised me. I had expected something alien about the process of an Ashkari consuming food, and instead it sounded like a person eating. Small sounds, measured, unhurried. Then she spoke. The Ashkari voice is, how do I describe it? The frequency range is different from human speech in ways that the advisories describe clinically, and which are completely inadequate preparation for actually hearing one. It's not deeper or higher exactly. It has a resonance quality that feels like it's coming from more than one place at once, like the sound is being generated at multiple points simultaneously, which gives it an overtone quality that human voices don't have. Not unpleasant, genuinely, not unpleasant. Specific and memorable and impossible to mistake for a human voice. She said, in common galactic, which all Covenant military personnel could speak and which I had learned to conversational fluency. You didn't report the corridor. It wasn't a question. She had access to whatever reporting had come out of Muravith security logs. She knew I had filed no incident report. She was not asking whether I had. I said, in a voice that I am not proud of for its steadiness, I didn't think I needed to. Pause, a specific considered pause. You were correct, she said. Another pause. I risked a look up. This was not, technically, direct eye contact. I was looking at the general region of her face rather than into her eyes specifically, which is a distinction that probably sounds absurd but felt meaningful in the moment. The clearance document, I said. I wasn't sure how to complete the sentence. Your route is legitimate, she said. The checkpoint redundancy serves no function for your cargo category. The administrative load is inherited from a regulation written before your species' freight classification was standardized. She said this the way you'd say something obvious. Not dismissive, she wasn't talking down to me. She was explaining a bureaucratic inefficiency the way someone might explain why a door sticks. Here is the mechanism. Here is why the mechanism is failing. Here is the correction. I said thank you. She made a very small sound. Not agreement, not dismissal, something in between. She ate something else. Then, without preliminary, she said, "What was your assessment of me?" I did not understand the question immediately. I said so. In the corridor, she said, your assessment of what I was. And here is the thing I'm still thinking about. I could have given her a diplomatic answer. I could have deflected. She would have known I was deflecting, given what I knew about Ashkari threat assessment capability, but I could have tried. Instead, I said, without planning to, because something about sitting 3 feet from something that could read my physiological responses meant that performing wasn't really an option. I was terrified. I thought I'd made a mistake that was going to have consequences. I thought you were, I don't know. I thought you were going to do something. And when I did not, I was confused, I said, and then I was more confused when I got the clearance document. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are not the first human freight operator to make accidental visual contact with an Ashkari unit member in a station environment. The typical response pattern is fear, immediate departure, report filing, request for alternate customs processing to avoid future contact. She paused. You did not file the report. I didn't think it was necessary, I said again. Explain. I thought about it. I actually sat there and thought about it rather than saying something safe. What I finally said was, you turned back to what you were doing. You decided I wasn't a problem. That felt like, I don't know, like a conclusion, not a threat. Just an assessment that ended with me not being worth escalating over. Something changed in her posture, very slightly. I would have missed it if I hadn't been watching carefully. Something loosened, not relaxed, the wrong word, but settled. Like a calculation that had been running, was completed. Accurate, she said. We sat in silence for a while. It was not entirely comfortable, and it was not as terrifying as it had been. She finished eating. I managed to eat some of what was in front of me without dropping it. Around us, the common area had returned to approximately normal activity levels, with a notable clear radius of about 4 meters around our table that I suspected would remain for as long as she was present. Before she left, she said one more thing. She said it while standing, already in motion, already moving toward the exit in that economy of motion way she seemed to do everything. Your people have a word for being seen and not found wanting. I don't know what the word is, but the concept exists. Remember that. Then she left. I sat at that table for a long time after she left. Document 8. What came next? The following MONTHS and what I understood. Personal testimony, D. Marsh. Recorded cycle 453. The route clearance authorization was real. I used it on the next 3 runs, and it was exactly what it claimed to be, 3 checkpoints instead of 7, 40% faster transit, no additional complications. Other freight operators noticed. When you run outer corridor routes, you talk to other operators at the stations, and a clearance like that is immediately visible to anyone running the same lanes. People asked questions I didn't know how to answer. I said there was a documentation review that had corrected an old routing error, which was technically what the authorization document said, so it wasn't a lie. I thought about the Ashkari warrior regularly in the months after Muraveth. Not obsessively, it wasn't that kind of thing. But in the quiet moments of long transits, in the processing time between manifests, in the half-awake state of night rotations, I turned the encounter over and looked at it from different angles. What I had been told about the Ashkari, what I had experienced, the space between those two things. The advisories and the whispered loading bay conversations all focused on the danger, the speed, the assessment capability, the consequence of triggering aggression. What they didn't prepare you for was the precision of the non-aggression. The fact that the same capability that could read your threat potential in 1.2 seconds could also, apparently, read the absence of threat with equal accuracy. Could read something more than threat or its absence. What she had seen in 1 second in that corridor was not just that I wasn't dangerous. It was something more specific than that. I've thought about what that might have been. Maybe it was the genuine absence of deceit, the fact that my fear was honest and not the kind of fear that hides something else behind it. Maybe it was something about the particular quality of the accident, that the eye contact was genuinely accidental, not a probe, not a challenge, not anything that the advisories warned about. Maybe the Ashkari assessment capability was fine enough to distinguish between those things in a way that a simple threat, no threat binary couldn't capture. I don't know, I can't know, but I believe it now, and I didn't believe it before Muraveth, that the Ashkari weren't simply weapons deployed in Covenant-controlled space. They were minds, very fast, very capable, very differently constructed minds, but minds nonetheless. Minds that made judgments based on more information than I gave them credit for. Minds that could decide, apparently, that a frightened and honest cargo worker who hadn't done anything wrong deserved something other than the full weight of what they represented. She had seen me, really seen me. In 1 second in a dim corridor in a station at the edge of contested space. And she had found, not that I was good, not that I was exceptional, nothing dramatic like that. Just that I wasn't what the situation feared I might be. That my presence in that corridor was what it appeared to be, a tired person running late for a customs appointment. And in response to that, she had corrected a bureaucratic inefficiency that had been adding unnecessary checkpoint stops to my route for 9 years. It sounds small. In the context of human covenant relations in those years, it sounds impossibly small. But I have been thinking about small things and large things a lot in the 6 years since, and I've come to believe that large things, understanding between species, the slow grinding recalibration of how two radically different kinds of intelligence see each other. Large things are built from small ones, from moments that don't make it into the history records. From a corridor at hour zero dark on an ugly transit station in the Amber Corridor, where an ordinary man looked up at the wrong moment and found himself seen, clearly and accurately, by something he'd spent his whole adult life being afraid of. And survived the seeing, more than survived. Came away from it with a clearance document and a question he'd never thought to ask before. What if they were afraid of us too? Document 9, the larger picture. Intelligence report fragments and human community response. Cross-referenced from Outer Corridor Human Community Network Archives, Cycle 449-452. Here's what I didn't know in those first weeks after Muraveth, and what I've spent years since piecing together from fragments. The Covenant expansion wasn't going the way the Covenant had planned. This was not public knowledge in Cycle 447. It was not information that reached freight workers in their loading bays or their dormitory bunks. But it was real, and it was changing the calculations at every level of the Covenant's strategic command, including the deployment and operational protocols of units like the Ashkari. The specific problem was humans. Not because we had done anything dramatic. We weren't at war with the Covenant. We hadn't developed some unexpected weapon technology or found a strategic partner among the other contested space species who could shift the power balance. We hadn't done anything large. We had done 100,000 small things, and the accumulation of small things was showing up in the Covenant's administrative models in ways that their strategic analysts apparently hadn't predicted. Human freight operators, under the checkpoint burdens of Covenant regulations, had developed adaptive routing systems. We were, collectively, the most experienced navigators of the checkpoint infrastructure in the outer corridors, because we had the most to lose from delays and the most motivation to find efficient paths through a system that wasn't designed with us in mind. Our collective routing knowledge, shared through the networks that freight operators maintain because survival requires it, had made us de facto experts in the Covenant's own infrastructure. Human communities and outer corridor stations, under the pressure of being the newest and least resourced population in those spaces, had developed mutual support systems. We pooled information. We shared clearances when we could. We collectively negotiated with station management in ways that individual operators couldn't. We were, without any central coordination, learning to function as a coherent economic entity in a system that hadn't expected us to become one. Human children born on outer corridor stations, and there were more of them every cycle, because people build families wherever they are, under whatever conditions, were growing up bilingual in common galactic from birth. We're growing up knowing the checkpoint protocols, the Covenant species characteristics, the administrative structures, not as alien and threatening, but as simply part of the environment they lived in. We're, in a quiet and unprecedented way, beginning to develop the kind of deep fluency in Covenant systems that only came from being born into them. The Covenant's models, I would later learn, had anticipated human response to the expansion in 3 possible categories: compliance expected, conflict manageable, or departure acceptable. The thing their models hadn't anticipated was adaptation, the specific, patient, pragmatic, completely non-dramatic adaptation that humans seem to default to under sustained pressure. The way we learned systems rather than fighting them. The way we found efficiencies within constraints rather than expending ourselves against the constraints themselves. The Ashkari deployment to high human traffic stations had been, in part, intended to calibrate what the Covenant called civilian behavioral compliance, which is a polite way of saying they wanted to maintain the low-level ambient fear that kept human populations navigable and predictable. An Ashkari presence in a station reliably reduced human autonomous action, unauthorized clustering, and what the Covenant classified as irregular economic coordination. Except that over time, the Ashkari themselves were generating data that complicated the model. Because the Ashkari, with their threat assessment capability, their physiological read accuracy, their decades of proximity to human populations in contested space stations, were developing something the Covenant's strategic planners also hadn't fully anticipated. They were developing an accurate picture of what humans actually were. Not the threat model, not the compliance model, the actual picture. What the Ashkari were seeing, one assessment at a time, one corridor encounter at a time, was a species that was scared and tired and underprepared and adapting anyway. A species that wasn't going to stop being present in contested space because it didn't have anywhere else that was reliably better to go. A species with a specific and actually fairly impressive resilience capacity. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the grinding, practical, get up and try again kind that tends to be invisible from the outside until it's been happening for a very long time and suddenly you look at your models and they don't match the reality anymore. I'm speculating about some of this. I want to be clear. I don't have direct access to Covenant strategic records, but the fragments that have come out over the years from various sources suggest that the period around cycle 444-55 was when the Covenant's assessment of humanity began to shift in meaningful ways. And the Ashkari, with their impossibly precise perception capability, were part of that shift. Maybe a significant part. They were, in a sense, telling the Covenant what they saw. And what they saw, one freight worker, one station worker, one outer corridor human at a time, was something that wasn't what anyone had predicted. Document 10, 6 years later, what I understand now. Final recording D. Marsh, personal recorder. I've thought about how to end this account, what the right note is, what I want whoever finds this recorder, if anyone does, if anything I've said is useful to anyone, to take away from a story about an ordinary man who looked up at the wrong moment in a dim corridor and came home changed. Here's what I know now that I didn't know before Corridor 9. Fear is information. The fear I had carried for 9 years about the Ashkari was real information about real capability. It wasn't wrong to be afraid. The Ashkari were everything the advisories said, fast and capable and operating with a precision that made human military capability look approximate. That wasn't false. That fear was earned by reality. But fear is only information. It is not the whole story. It is not even close to the whole story, most of the time. And when fear becomes the only information you're using to navigate something, you start missing things. You start filtering out data that doesn't fit the danger model because the danger model is running at full capacity and there's no room left. What I missed for 9 years was the other side of the assessment. The fact that the same capability that could determine threat in 1.2 seconds could determine non-threat with equal accuracy. The fact that precision cuts in every direction. If an Ashkari warrior could recognize danger with that level of clarity, then what she brought to the recognition of its absence was the same instrument, the same resolution, the same unflinching accuracy. She looked at me, and she saw a tired cargo worker running late for a customs appointment who had accidentally made eye contact and was now trying very hard not to die of embarrassment and fear. She saw that with total clarity, and she responded to what was actually there, not to what the model said should be there. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not the scariness of the Ashkari, the capability, the speed, the precision, but the accuracy. The fact that something with that much capacity for harm chose, repeatedly, to point that capacity at reality and respond to what reality was rather than what the category assumed it would be. We are so bad at that. Humans. We are so thoroughly shaped by our categories and our models and our prior experiences that we spend most of our lives responding to what we expect things to be rather than what they are. And in those years in contested space with the Covenant expansion pressing on every side, our model of the Ashkari was threat, danger, avoid, do not engage. And the model wasn't wrong, but it was incomplete. And the incompleteness had consequences. 9 years of unnecessary checkpoint stops. 9 years of taking inefficient routes because someone in the freight authority had decided that efficient routes through Ashkari-heavy sectors were higher risk than longer Ashkari-avoided routes. 9 years. She fixed that with one route authorization document. Because in 5 seconds in a corridor, she had seen more accurately than our administrative system had in 9 years. I'm not making a grand claim here. I'm not saying the Covenant was right. I'm not saying the Ashkari were our friends or that the system they served was just. It wasn't, and I don't want to smooth that over with sentiment. The expansion was what it was. The structural inequality was real. The fear that human populations lived under in those years was real. I don't want to sentimentalize any of that away. But I am saying this. Whatever comes next, and something is coming next, you can feel it in the outer corridors even now, the slow shift in the calculations, the way the Covenant's models are straining against a reality they didn't plan for. It will be built on moments. Not grand gestures, not official negotiations and treaty signings, though those will come eventually too. It will be built on small moments of accurate seeing. On the accumulated weight of one species looking at another, and responding to what's actually there rather than what the model says should be there. A corridor, an accidental glance, a head tilting 20 degrees in the amber light. An assessment that ended in a bureaucratic correction rather than a crisis. Small moments, but I believe, sitting here 6 years later, that they're the real architecture of whatever the future is going to be. She saw me, clearly, and without the diplomatic softening that we extend to each other out of social habit. She saw exactly what I was, in the worst possible conditions for honesty, frightened, exposed, stripped of all the management strategies that I used to navigate the world. And what she did next, after the tilted head, after the returned attention to her work, after the data chit pressed into my hand, after the common area table, after the conversation I hadn't been prepared for, what she did was treat what she saw as sufficient. An ordinary man, running late for a customs appointment, who was telling the truth about being scared. She found that sufficient. I'm still figuring out what that means for everything else.